The secret I kept for 15 years was never about what I wanted to say. It was about what I was afraid to lose. Ryan Mitchell stood beneath the old oak tree at the edge of our hometown park, holding a small wooden box that looked like it had survived years of forgotten seasons. His expression was calm, but there was something different in his eyes, something I could not understand. "Noah, before you leave tomorrow, there is something I should have told you a long time ago." I remember those words clearly because they were the moment my entire understanding of the past began to change. But before that night, before the confession, before the truth finally came out, I had to return to where everything started. 15 years earlier, Ryan was not the person standing in front of me with a secret. He was my best friend. The person who knew my favorite songs, remembered every small detail I mentioned, and somehow always appeared whenever I needed someone beside me. We grew up together in a quiet town outside Portland, Oregon, where everyone knew each other and summer evenings seemed to last forever. Ryan and I spent countless afternoons riding bikes through familiar streets, exploring the trails behind the community center, and talking about the futures we imagined for ourselves. Back then, we believed nothing could change the friendship we had built. Life, however, had its own plans. After high school, we slowly moved in different directions. I left for college and eventually built a career as an illustrator, creating artwork for educational projects and children's books. Ryan stayed focused on architecture and community design, eventually moving to Seattle to build the career he had always dreamed about. We kept in touch at first. A message here, a phone call there. Then the distance became longer, the conversations became less frequent, and somehow years passed without either of us realizing how much time had disappeared. When I received the invitation to return home for the annual town festival, I almost ignored it. My schedule was busy, and I had convinced myself that returning to the past was unnecessary. But something inside me told me to go. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe some part of me wondered what had happened to the person who once knew me better than anyone. I did not expect Ryan to be there. When I saw him standing near the festival entrance, holding 2 cups of coffee like he already knew I would arrive, the years between us suddenly felt much shorter. He smiled the same way he always had, but there was a quiet maturity in his expression that reminded me we were no longer teenagers chasing impossible dreams. "It has been a long time, Noah," he said. I smiled back. "Yeah, it has." We spent the afternoon walking through the town we once called home, remembering old places and laughing about memories we thought we had forgotten. Everything felt familiar, yet something about Ryan seemed different. There were moments when he looked like he wanted to say something but stopped himself. I noticed it, but I did not ask. I thought maybe some things were better left in the past. I had no idea that Ryan had been carrying a secret for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to finally share it with me. I thought I knew everything about my oldest friend, but that summer I discovered there were parts of his story I had never seen. The morning after the festival, I woke up in my childhood bedroom feeling strangely disconnected from time. The familiar walls, the old bookshelf, and the quiet neighborhood outside the window reminded me of a version of myself I had almost forgotten. Returning home was supposed to be a simple weekend visit, a chance to attend the town festival and catch up with people I had not seen in years. I never expected it to reopen memories I had carefully placed in the past. Ryan arrived at my parents' house that afternoon with 2 cups of coffee and the same thoughtful expression he always carried. "I remembered you still like yours with extra cream," he said. I smiled because it was such a small detail, yet somehow it proved that 15 years had not erased everything. "You still remember that?" I asked. Ryan looked away for a moment and smiled softly. "Some things are easy to remember." We spent the day walking through places that had shaped our childhood. We visited the small bookstore where we used to spend Saturday mornings, the community center where we first met, and the quiet path behind the park where we used to talk about our dreams. Every location seemed to hold a memory. Every corner reminded me of how naturally Ryan had always been part of my life. As we walked, I began noticing things I had ignored when we were younger. Ryan always made sure I got home safely after late events. He always remembered important days even when I forgot them myself. He always encouraged my art when I was uncertain about my talent. At the time, I thought that was simply what best friends did. Looking back now, I wondered if there had been more behind those moments. Do you ever think about how different things could have been? Ryan asked while we sat on a bench overlooking the park. His question surprised me. Different how? I replied. He looked toward the trees before answering. Just different. If we had made different choices. If life had taken another direction. I studied his expression, trying to understand what he meant. There was something unspoken behind his words, something he seemed to be carefully protecting. Ryan, is there something you want to tell me? I finally asked. For a moment he was silent. Then he smiled slightly and shook his head. Not yet. That answer stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it bothered me, but because it confirmed something I had already started feeling. Ryan was carrying a story he had never shared. Later that evening, we joined the festival crowd again. Music filled the streets, families gathered around food stands, and the entire town seemed frozen in the same peaceful atmosphere I remembered from years ago. Yet while everyone celebrated, I noticed Ryan standing quietly near the old oak tree where we used to leave notes for our future selves. He looked at the tree for a long time before noticing me watching him. That place still means something to you? I asked. Ryan smiled gently. More than you know. I did not realize it then, but that tree held the beginning of the secret he had carried for 15 years. And soon I would finally understand why he had never been able to let go of the past. The next morning arrived with the slow rhythm only a small town could offer. Sunlight filtered through the tall maple trees lining the sidewalks, while the familiar smell of fresh coffee drifted from the little cafe that had somehow remained unchanged through the years. Ryan was already waiting outside when I arrived, leaning casually against his truck with 2 paper cups in his hands. I figured we should continue our tour before you head back tomorrow, he said with an easy smile. I accepted the coffee and laughed quietly. You always seem to know what I need before I do. He shrugged as though it was nothing, but there was a softness in his expression that made me wonder how many small moments like this I had overlooked while we were growing up. We spent the morning walking through neighborhoods that once felt enormous when we were children. Every street seemed smaller now, yet every corner carried a memory waiting to be rediscovered. We passed the old baseball field where Ryan had patiently practiced with me even though I rarely managed to hit the ball. We stopped outside the library where he used to wait after school because he knew I would lose track of time reading. We even found the small bridge where we had promised each other that no matter where life took us, we would always stay friends. Standing there again, I realized Ryan had remembered every promise we had ever made, while I had simply assumed life would always keep us connected without any effort. Do you remember the science fair? Ryan asked suddenly. I smiled. The volcano that never erupted? He laughed. Exactly. You were so disappointed that you wanted to throw the whole project away. I shook my head. I had forgotten about that. Ryan looked at me with a quiet smile. I stayed up all night helping you build another one. I stared at him for a second before another memory surfaced. He had been there. I had always remembered winning second place, but I had forgotten who stayed beside me until sunrise, making sure I did not give up. As we continued walking, more forgotten details returned. Ryan was the one who quietly convinced my parents to let me attend my first art workshop. Ryan was the one who drove across town after getting his driver's license just to deliver my sketchbook when I accidentally left it at school. Ryan was always there, never asking for recognition, never expecting anything in return. You did a lot for me, I said thoughtfully. He looked ahead instead of at me. You would have done the same. I wanted to answer immediately, but something stopped me. Would I have noticed all the little ways he needed someone too? The question lingered longer than I expected. That afternoon we wandered toward the edge of town where the old oak tree stood overlooking a quiet meadow. The branches were larger now, casting wide shadows across the grass exactly as they had years before. Ryan slowed his pace as we approached it. His expression became noticeably more serious, and without saying a word he rested one hand against the rough bark. This place has been waiting a long time, he said quietly. I looked at him with growing curiosity. Waiting for what? He let out a slow breath before looking directly into my eyes. For both of us to come back together. Before I could ask another question, he knelt beside the roots and brushed away a thin layer of fallen leaves. Beneath them, barely visible after so many years, was the corner of something wooden buried beneath the earth. My heartbeat quickened as Ryan carefully uncovered the small box, gently lifting it into the sunlight with hands that suggested he had imagined this moment countless times. Whatever had remained hidden inside that weathered box was about to change everything I believed about our friendship. Ryan carefully brushed the remaining dirt from the weathered wooden box before setting it between us beneath the old oak tree. The afternoon breeze moved gently through the branches overhead, carrying the familiar scent of grass and pine that had filled so many summers of our childhood. For a long moment, neither of us reached toward the box. It seemed almost impossible that something buried for so many years could still carry so much meaning. Ryan rested one hand lightly on the worn lid and smiled with quiet nervousness. "Do you remember the day we buried this?" I searched my memory until a faded image slowly returned. We had just finished sophomore year of high school. We filled a small box with keepsakes and promised we would open it together someday after our lives had finally settled down. At 16, we believed adulthood would be simple. We believed dreams always happened exactly the way we planned. "I remember making the promise," I said softly. "I forgot where we buried it." Ryan laughed quietly. "I never forgot." His answer lingered in the air as he slowly lifted the lid. Inside, everything had been protected remarkably well. There were faded movie tickets from the first film we watched together, photographs from school events, a friendship bracelet I had completely forgotten making, an old baseball signed by classmates, and several small souvenirs collected during family vacations. Every object carried a memory that immediately returned the moment I saw it. I picked up one of the photographs showing the two of us standing beside the community center with oversized backpacks before our first hiking trip. "I cannot believe you kept all of this," I said. Ryan watched me with a gentle smile. "Some memories deserve a safe place." As I carefully explored the box, I noticed something unusual beneath the photographs. A bundle of envelopes tied together with a blue ribbon rested neatly in one corner. The paper had yellowed slightly with time, but every envelope looked carefully preserved. None of them had stamps. None of them had ever been mailed. I looked up at Ryan with growing curiosity. "What are these?" His smile disappeared, replaced by an expression I had never seen before. It was not fear exactly. It was relief mixed with years of hesitation. "Those are the reason I asked you to come here." I untied the ribbon carefully and noticed my own name written across the front of every envelope in Ryan's familiar handwriting. There were dozens of them. Some looked newer than others, but each one carried a different date stretching back across 15 years. My heart began beating faster. "Ryan," my voice barely rose above a whisper, "you wrote all of these to me?" He nodded slowly without looking away. "Every time something important happened. Every birthday. Every promotion. Every time I wanted to call but convinced myself I should not. Every time I missed my best friend." I stared at the stack of unopened letters resting in my hands, struggling to understand what I was seeing. "Why did you never send them?" Ryan looked toward the old oak tree before answering. "Because every time I finished writing one, I became afraid that saying too much would cost me the only friendship that ever truly mattered to me." Silence settled gently between us. The breeze continued moving through the branches while sunlight filtered across the scattered keepsakes around the open box. I had spent years believing distance alone had slowly changed our friendship. Sitting beneath the tree with those unopened letters in my hands, I realized there had always been another story waiting quietly beneath the surface. And I could feel that the truth Ryan had protected for 15 years was finally beginning to find its way into the light. My hands trembled slightly as I held the bundle of letters. The blue ribbon that had kept them together for 15 years suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. I looked at the dates written neatly in the corner of each envelope. One every year. Sometimes 2. Sometimes 3. They marked birthdays, graduations, promotions, holidays, and ordinary afternoons when Ryan had apparently chosen to write instead of speak. "You really kept writing all this time?" I whispered. Ryan nodded quietly. "I never stopped." I carefully opened the oldest envelope. The paper inside had faded just enough to reveal its age, but Ryan's handwriting remained steady and familiar. The first lines immediately caught my attention. Noah, today you told me you wanted to become an artist. I think you will. I hope one day you see yourself the way I already do. I paused, unable to continue for a moment. You wrote this when we were 16? Ryan smiled softly. The night after we buried the box. I continued reading. Every letter sounded like a conversation we never had. Ryan described ordinary moments from his life, encouraged me through challenges I never knew he had, noticed, celebrated accomplishments he had only learned about from mutual friends, and quietly admitted how much he missed having me nearby. None of the letters demanded anything. None of them asked for an answer. They simply existed because he needed a place to keep feelings he could never say aloud. I opened another envelope written several years later after I graduated from college. He congratulated me on my first illustration job even though we had barely spoken that year. Another letter celebrated the day I published my first children's book. Another mentioned how proud he felt after seeing one of my interviews online. I slowly looked up from the pages. You followed everything I did. Ryan gave a small nod. Whenever I could. I searched his face, trying to understand why someone would carry so much without ever asking for anything in return. Ryan, why? He took a long breath before finally answering the question he had avoided for so many years. Because I fell in love with my best friend when we were 15. The words settled quietly between us beneath the old oak tree. There was no dramatic music, no raised voices, only the sound of leaves moving gently overhead. Ryan continued before I could respond. At first I thought it would disappear. I told myself it was just part of growing up. But every year it stayed exactly the same. I wanted to tell you so many times, but every possibility ended the same way in my mind. If I said the wrong thing, I would lose the person who mattered most to me. He lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at me. Keeping the secret hurt, but losing our friendship would have hurt even more. I felt every memory from our childhood rearranging itself inside my mind. Every encouraging word, every unexpected visit, every small act of kindness I had always explained as simple friendship suddenly carried a meaning I had never recognized. Ryan had never changed. Only my understanding of him had. I gently placed the letters back into the wooden box, realizing they represented 15 years of patience, hope, and quiet courage. Looking at Ryan across the scattered keepsakes of our shared childhood, I understood that the greatest surprise was not that he had loved me for so long. It was that he had chosen to protect our friendship every single day, even when it meant carrying his own heart in silence. Neither of us spoke for what felt like a very long time. The quiet beneath the old oak tree was filled only with the sound of leaves moving gently in the afternoon breeze. The wooden box remained open between us, surrounded by photographs, letters, and small pieces of a friendship that had somehow survived 15 years without either of us fully understanding what it meant. I looked at Ryan, searching for the right words, but everything I wanted to say seemed far too small compared to everything he had carried alone. I do not know what to say, I admitted honestly. Ryan gave a small, understanding smile. You do not have to say anything right now. His calmness somehow made the moment even more emotional. He had waited 15 years for this conversation, yet he was still giving me all the time I needed. I lowered my eyes toward the letters once again. All these years, I thought you slowly stopped needing me, I said quietly. When we talked less after college, I convinced myself that life had simply moved us in different directions. Ryan slowly shook his head. It was never that. He picked up one of the old photographs from the box, studying it for a moment before continuing. Every time I wanted to call, I worried I would interrupt your new life. Every time I wanted to visit, I thought maybe you had already found people who understood you better than I ever could. I looked at him with surprise. I thought exactly the same thing about you. We both laughed softly, not because anything was funny, but because it felt almost unbelievable that two people could spend so many years protecting each other from fears that neither of them actually believed. We wasted a lot of time, I whispered. Ryan nodded slowly. Maybe, but I would rather arrive here late than never arrive at all. His answer stayed with me. It was not filled with regret. It was filled with hope. I realized that was one of the things I had always admired about him. Even when life became complicated, Ryan somehow continued believing that tomorrow could still become something better. We carefully placed the keepsakes back inside the wooden box together, taking our time as though each item deserved one final moment in the sunlight. When I reached for the bundle of letters, Ryan gently stopped me. "Keep them," he said. I looked at him in surprise. "These belong to you." He smiled and shook his head. "No. They were always meant for you. I was simply too afraid to deliver them." I held the letters against my chest, overwhelmed by the thought that every page represented a year of his life, a year of feelings quietly preserved instead of forgotten. We remained beneath the oak tree until the afternoon light slowly softened into evening. Our conversation gradually shifted away from the past and toward the present. Ryan told me about the community projects he hoped to complete over the next few years. I shared ideas for a children's book I had wanted to illustrate but never found the confidence to begin. The conversation felt natural, almost effortless, like rediscovering a language we had once spoken every day. Before we finally stood to leave, I looked once more at the old tree towering above us. "I spent years wondering why our friendship slowly disappeared," I said. "Now I realize it never really disappeared. We were both just protecting each other in the only way we thought we could." Ryan's expression softened. "Maybe that is what growing up teaches us," he replied. "Sometimes people become quiet, not because they care less, but because they care so deeply that they become afraid of saying the wrong thing." As we began walking back toward town together, carrying the wooden box and 15 years of untold memories with us, I no longer felt like someone returning home for a short visit. For the first time in a very long while, it felt as though I had finally found the missing part of a story that had been waiting patiently for both of us to continue writing it together. That evening arrived far more quickly than I wanted. The annual festival continued filling the streets with music, warm lights, and familiar laughter, yet everything around me seemed quieter than before. Maybe it was because my mind was still trying to absorb everything Ryan had shared beneath the old oak tree. 15 years of letters rested safely inside my travel bag, and every time I thought about them, I found myself wondering how differently life might have unfolded if even one of those envelopes had reached me years ago. Ryan and I walked slowly through the festival together, stopping occasionally to greet old classmates and neighbors who still remembered us as the inseparable pair who once spent every afternoon together. Several people smiled and joked that it was nice to see us side by side again. We laughed politely, but neither of us explained how much had changed over the past 2 days. Some stories were too personal to tell before they had fully settled inside our own hearts. As the evening continued, Ryan suggested we buy dinner from one of the local food stands overlooking the river. We found a quiet picnic table away from the larger crowds where conversation came naturally once again. We spoke about work, family, favorite books, and places we still hope to visit someday. It felt surprisingly easy. For the first time in years, there was nothing hidden between us. Yet despite that comfort, another reality slowly approached with every passing hour. My flight back to Portland was scheduled for early the next afternoon. Eventually, I glanced at my phone to confirm the departure time. Ryan noticed immediately, though he pretended not to. "Heading home tomorrow?" he asked gently. I nodded. "Around noon." He looked toward the river instead of meeting my eyes. "That is sooner than I expected." I smiled faintly. It was only supposed to be a weekend visit. Neither of us said anything after that. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt heavy with possibilities neither of us seemed ready to name. Later, as the festival fireworks began lighting the night sky, colorful reflections shimmered across the water while families gathered along the riverbank to watch together. Ryan and I stood quietly among them. I realized this was exactly the kind of evening we would have shared effortlessly years ago without thinking about tomorrow. Now every beautiful moment seemed to carry the quiet reminder that time was moving forward again. "Noah," Ryan said softly as another burst of light illuminated the sky, "I am glad you came home." I turned toward him. "I am glad I did too." Those simple words carried far more meaning than either of us explained. After the fireworks ended, Ryan drove me back to my parents' house. When we stopped in the driveway, neither of us reached for the door immediately. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for telling me the truth." Ryan smiled with the same warmth that had always made me feel understood. "Thank you for listening." I stepped out of the truck, then paused before closing the door. For a brief moment, I almost asked him the question that had been sitting quietly in my heart all evening. What happens now? Instead, I simply wished him good night. As his truck disappeared down the familiar street, I stood alone beneath the porch light, suddenly realizing how easy it would be for life to separate us once again. We had finally uncovered the truth behind 15 years of silence, but tomorrow I would return to Portland. Ryan would remain here before heading back to Seattle, and part of me feared that despite everything we had shared, this reunion might become another beautiful memory rather than the beginning of something new. I carried the letters inside with me, hoping they represented not the end of a long story, but the quiet promise that one more chapter still remained unwritten. The next morning arrived with clear skies and the quiet feeling that every goodbye seems to bring. My suitcase stood beside the front door, and the bundle of letters rested carefully inside my backpack, protected more carefully than anything else I was carrying. I kept thinking about everything Ryan had shared beneath the old oak tree, wondering how 15 years of silence had transformed into a single afternoon of honesty. My parents hugged me goodbye, reminding me to visit more often, and I promised I would. This time, however, the promise felt different. As I drove toward the edge of town, I realized I was not only leaving my hometown behind. I was leaving someone who had finally trusted me with the deepest part of his heart. The road leading toward the highway passed beside the old community park one last time. Without fully understanding why, I slowed down and looked toward the oak tree in the distance. It stood quietly beneath the morning sun, exactly as it had the day before. I smiled to myself before continuing toward the station where I planned to catch the afternoon train connecting me back to Portland. The platform was calm, with only a handful of travelers waiting beside the tracks. I checked the departure board, adjusted my backpack, and took a deep breath. Everything around me suggested that life was returning to normal. Then I heard someone calling my name. "Noah." I turned around immediately. Ryan was walking toward me, slightly out of breath but smiling with the same warmth that had always made me feel at home. He stopped a few feet away and laughed quietly. "I was hoping I would get here before your train." I smiled in surprise. "I thought we already said goodbye." Ryan shook his head gently. "We did. That was the problem." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Morning sunlight reflected across the station windows, while the announcement for my arriving train echoed softly through the platform. Ryan reached into the back seat of his truck and carefully lifted a small canvas bag. He handed it to me without saying anything. Curious, I opened it and discovered another collection of envelopes, each one carefully arranged in chronological order. "There are more?" I asked, unable to hide my surprise. Ryan nodded. "Those are the letters I wrote after I buried the first bundle beneath the tree. I never stopped writing." I looked at the stack in disbelief. "Ryan." He took a slow breath before speaking again. "Yesterday I told you about the past. Today I want to tell you about the future." His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet determination. "I spent 15 years believing silence was safer than honesty. I do not want to live that way anymore." He looked directly into my eyes. "I do not expect an answer today, and I do not want you to feel pressured by everything I confessed. I only want you to know that whatever happens next, I would rather face uncertainty with the truth than certainty built on silence." I felt every wall I had built around my heart slowly disappear. I realized that during all those years apart, I had never truly stopped trusting Ryan. I had only stopped believing that life would ever bring us back together. I stepped closer and gently held the canvas bag containing the letters. "You know," I said with a quiet smile, "I spent a long time wondering why every important moment in my life somehow felt incomplete." Ryan watched me without speaking. "Now I think I finally understand. The person I always wanted to share those moments with was never really gone. We were both just too afraid to reach across the distance. Relief spread across his face, replacing years of quiet uncertainty with genuine hope. As the train approached the platform, I realized I was no longer thinking about another goodbye. For the first time in 15 years, I was thinking about all the conversations we still had left to have, and somehow that felt like the most exciting journey either of us had ever begun. 1 year later, I stepped off the morning train carrying a small backpack instead of the heavy suitcase I had brought the year before. The familiar station looked almost unchanged, but everything inside me felt different. Some places remain the same, while the people who return to them discover they have quietly become someone new. Ryan was waiting near the platform entrance, holding 2 cups of coffee exactly the way he had on the day we first saw each other again. This time, however, there was no hesitation between us. We smiled at the same moment, and somehow that simple exchange carried more meaning than all the words we had struggled to say for so many years. "Welcome home," Ryan said as he handed me one of the cups. I laughed softly. It feels more like coming home now than it did a year ago. During the months that followed my visit, we never allowed silence to build another wall between us. We talked almost every evening, visited each other whenever our schedules allowed, celebrated birthdays together, encouraged one another through difficult projects, and slowly discovered that honesty became much easier once fear was no longer leading the conversation. We never tried to recover the years we had lost because we finally understood something important. The past could not be rewritten, but the future could still be written together. Ryan eventually accepted a position that allowed him to spend more time working on community projects closer to Portland. I continued illustrating children's books, and for the first time in years I found new inspiration in ordinary moments instead of searching for extraordinary ones. Happiness, I realized, often grows quietly through consistency rather than dramatic change. That afternoon we walked back to the old oak tree carrying the same wooden box that had brought the truth into the open. The grass surrounding it had grown thicker, and the branches stretched even farther across the meadow, offering generous shade beneath the warm summer sun. Ryan carefully placed the box on the ground before opening it one last time. The old photographs, faded movie tickets, friendship bracelet, baseball, and empty ribbons still rested exactly where we had left them. I smiled as I reached into my backpack and removed something new. It was a recent photograph of the 2 of us standing beside the river during last autumn, both laughing at something neither of us could even remember anymore. Ryan smiled when he saw it. "That one should stay here," he said. I nodded before placing the photograph inside the box. Then I unfolded a handwritten letter. "I wrote this together with you in mind," I said. Ryan looked at me with quiet curiosity while I carefully tucked the letter beside the photograph. On the outside of the envelope we had written only one sentence. "For whoever opens this someday, never let fear speak louder than kindness or honesty." Ryan gently closed the wooden lid, and together we returned the box beneath the roots of the old oak tree. This time we did not bury unfinished feelings or unanswered questions. We buried gratitude for everything that had brought us back to this moment. As we stood together beneath the wide branches, Ryan reached for my hand, and I held his without hesitation. Nothing about the gesture felt rushed. It simply felt right, like the natural continuation of a friendship that had quietly become something deeper through patience, trust, and understanding. We began walking back toward town as the afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, talking about weekend plans, future travels, and the ordinary routines we now looked forward to sharing. Looking back one final time at the old oak tree, I realized it had never been protecting a secret. It had been protecting hope until both of us were finally ready to receive it. Sometimes the greatest gift life offers is not another chance to change the past. It is the courage to stop hiding from the future, take one honest step forward, and discover that the person you have been searching for has been patiently walking toward you all along.